in the intro, but I think it might as well.
Excellent. So good evening and welcome everyone. Usually we're accustomed to welcoming people to a place. And I guess the place tonight is the Lower East Side via Zoom and via our archives. Tonight at the American Jewish Historical Society, we decided to do a new kind of program. Rather than having people talk about an issue, what we decided to do is start with our archival collections and work with a wonderful assortment of photographs that document the Lower East Side in the 1930s. And in a way, we're able to do this better in this format than we would if we were together in person, because this format allows us to zoom in to different details on the photographs that we might not have otherwise noticed. And in a way, you're going to be able to see things through this format in the photos that you wouldn't be able to see if you had the photographs in your hand. And it's possible that you'll be able to see things and details that the photographers themselves did not see. So I'm so excited to welcome you and to welcome our wonderful guest, Deborah Moore, a professor of history at the University of Michigan, and Beth Wenger, a professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania. And their full bios have been circulating, so you'll see that they are the authors of many books. Most relevant for tonight, Deborah Moore's book, At Home in America, that looks at the most part at how Jews left the Lower East Side and went to other neighborhoods in the 1920s and 1930s. And Beth Wenger's book, Uncertain Promise, looks at New York Jews in the Great Depression. So we're kind of bringing these together to look at this amazing collection from the Graduate School of Jewish Social Work. So I'm going to start. My name is Annie Polland. I should introduce myself as well. I'm the executive director at the American Jewish Historical Society. And I've been at the American Jewish Historical Society for 2 years, but before that, I spent about 20 years working on the Lower East Side, whether as a walking tour guide, whether at the museum at Elder Street, or for the past decade or so, or before the 2 years, at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. So I'm going to start by showing you a photo that we would often show at the Tenement Museum, because it's a photo that when people think of the historic Lower East Side, they often think of this photo and what it conjures up. So it's a photo it's not quite this one. It's a big photo from 1898. Here we go, perfect. This photo is 1898. It's Orchard Street, the corner of Hester. This is at the point where the Lower East Side is probably the most crowded neighborhood in the country, perhaps in the world. And you can see that this is also the time where this is the largest Jewish city in the world. And there are signs in Yiddish. There are also lots of signs in English. And were you to walk down this street, you would hear some combination of Yiddish and English, often people themselves speaking a combination of Yiddish and English. It's hard to see from this photo, but hanging from the tenements are American flags. By the 1930s, the decade that we're going to focus on tonight, many of these people had left the Lower East Side. They had gone to Brooklyn, they had gone to the Bronx in search of roomier, airier, leafier neighborhoods as they Americanized. And further, immigrants who had always been coming to replace them had stopped coming because of the 1920s immigration quota laws. And so by the 1930s, the population for the first time is decreasing. And you have from maybe what was 500,000 in 1900, 1910, going down to 250,000 at the most. And so this depopulation was seized upon by the city and city planners in the late 1920s who said, let's get rid of this neighborhood. Why do we need these dark tenements? Why do we need everything that was of the past? And I'm just going to read you some quotes from the city planners so you get a sense of what the city planners were thinking about the Lower East Side. This is from a city plan in 1932. If a descriptive term can be applied broadly to so large an area, it may be said that the Lower East Side has been, for decades, America's most considerable and incorrigible slum. Manhattan Borough President Samuel Levy talked about how public officials, civic associations, mortgages, and property owners have come to the realization that the present slovenly conditions in the older sections of our American cities can no longer be tolerated. It is of great importance to the city that this district be improved as a residential neighborhood. So repeatedly what you see in these plans are reference to the Lower East Side's proximity to Wall Street. And the idea that with a little bit of construction, tearing things down, widening streets, they could create a beautiful neighborhood that would in essence serve as a suburb to Wall Street. And that was what motivated a lot of work. Now you can see in this photo plans for Allen Street. Allen Street, so half of the photo on the left is what the Lower East Side looked like when this was published in the early 30s. Actually late 20s, you can see the elevated and the cars, the subway trains going over the elevated train, not the subway, but the trains going over the elevated tracks, and how close that was to the tenements and how dark it would have been underneath it. So this was the epitome of the kind of squalid, horrible conditions of the Lower East Side. So the city planned to tear that down and widen the street and create parks and shrubbery and have a much airier, roomier space. Now, not all of this came to fruition, not quite as beautifully as it's depicted on the right side, but there were a lot of plans throughout the Lower East Side. Now, a lot of people looked at this and said, great, but the people who we're going to talk about tonight, social workers and photographers from the Jewish graduate, or the Graduate School of Jewish Social Work, were scared about this because they thought this change, this disruption would take away what they viewed as the charm of the Lower East Side, what they viewed as the remnants of a vibrant communal spirit, that they felt, again, this urgency to really document. We'll learn more about them tonight as we go through, but it's safe to say that they looked at this, if they saw this in the newspaper, that's what motivated them to say, we need to capture. So if we look at the next image, which is a map of the Lower East Side, and we'll situate you. So this isn't a full map of Manhattan, but the Lower East Side is named because it's, for the most part, the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the southern part. And this map shows in purple the places where the city had earmarked or planned to do major change. And it was actually more. A lot of it was along the waterfront, but also along Christie and Forsyth Street. They wanted to create a speedway. That didn't come to fruition. And Allen Street, we talked about earlier. But the yellow is the area of the photographs, for the most part, that we're going to see tonight. And it shows us the ways in which the photographers and the social workers purposely picked an area of the Lower East Side that was not undergoing change, because they were looking at the 1930s as a time to capture, even the remnants of what we saw earlier with the 1898 photo. So this is just a brief way of kind of introducing you to the kind of setting and looking at what the photographers were dealing with and what their motivations might have been. In the next image, here we go. So this is a photograph that is of the collection, but it's an outlier. So I'm including it earlier. This is an encampment along the East River. And again, this is on the borders of the Lower East Side, or the edge of the Lower East Side. This is not what they were focusing on. But if we zoom in, we can see a kind of encampment, men reading newspapers, setting up kind of places to eat. This is the Depression. So another part of the 1930s obviously was the Depression and how people were reacting to it. Again, the photographers did not focus on this, what we think of as the typical picture of the Lower East Side. Instead, they're going to, and of the Depression, instead they're going to show how the Depression is affecting daily life within that quarter that we looked at. So we're going to jump into the photographs. We're going to each take turns focusing, but we're going to try to have a conversation about it as well. To that point, if you have comments or questions, we encourage you to write them in the chat box, and as much as possible, we'll look to those, and we will also reserve time at the end for a more formal question and answer. So I'm going to hand things over to Professor Beth Wenger.
Thanks, Annie. That was a great introduction. Let me just say a couple of words about the Graduate School for Jewish Social Work, and also about this project and its intent, which you alluded to briefly. The Graduate School for Jewish Social Work opened its doors in 1925. And it actually, when it opened, it was called the Training School for Jewish Social Work. Changed its name around 1932. And you might be asking yourself, why a particular school for Jewish social work? And you have to understand that Jewish social work was very much a distinct field at the time. Jewish social workers had their own journals, their own associations, their own conferences. And in fact, Jewish social workers were very active and very influential in creating the broader profession of social work in this era. So they wanted at the time a school that was designed with the most sophisticated methods of social work at the time. And the people who taught there had been trained at very prestigious institutions for social work. But they also wanted to have some sense of serving the Jewish community, of teaching students about Jewish culture, so they'd be prepared to train to serve this particular population. So the school itself was actually fairly short-lived. It existed in earnest for about 15 years. It stopped accepting students by 1939 and stayed open a few more years until the graduate students in the program were able to finish. They offered a master's degree in social work, a master's degree in social service. And the reason the school closed had to do largely with changing modes of training in the profession, and also a real difficulty in financing the school, which had relied on various communal organizations and to support it that dwindled in the Great Depression. The other thing that happened is shifts in the profession. As I mentioned, the American Association of Social Workers started accrediting only those social work schools that had formal ties to colleges and universities. And of course, anyone going into social work wanted that kind of training. So this was short-lived, but very important, and some of the most the pioneers of Jewish social service went through this school, and also some leading individuals taught in it, sometimes part-time. For example, Selah Baron, the great historian who at Columbia University, taught a few classes there. So did Mordechai Kaplan at certain moments. So it was really an important institution despite its relatively short life. So let me say a couple words about this project. The inspiration for this project came primarily from JB Lightman, who had been a student at the school and then later the research librarian. Lightman himself was a relative newcomer to New York, and maybe that explains why he was enthralled by the sights and sounds of Jews in New York. But also, I think it's for the reasons Annie alluded to, that social workers and social scientists really wanted to document the East Side. And so when Lightman talked about the project, he first spoke of it in completely scientific terms. He described their copious collections of population data about how they wanted to document housing, religious life, charitable endeavors, business and commerce. And you'll see that in the images we're about to show you. He took to the streets, most often with a photographer also from the school named A.J. Simon, who took most of the photographs, we think. Occasionally, a woman named Esther Davidson substituted as a photographer, and there might have been others, maybe even Lightman himself took some of them. But mostly Lightman was recording brief notes in a diary, and that diary's been preserved along with the photographs in the collections of the AJHS. And I'll say the notes are quite intriguing. We'll read you a couple of them along the way. The researchers certainly understood Yiddish when it was spoken to them, but they often were unable to write it in their notes correctly or translate it exactly right. And this is quite typical of their generation of Jews, young Jews in the 1930s. And Lightman himself, when he talked about this project, admitted that the Lower East Side at an earlier date, like the 1898 photo that Annie showed you, would have been more appropriate to illuminate what he really wanted to show, the culture in its heyday, at the height of Jewish immigration. But he wrote, and this is a quote from his description, "There was a passing picture of Jewish communal life, a record of which someday would be a matter of historical importance." And that's what he wanted to record. As Annie said, a culture that he thought was disappearing. And I also want to say, for all the language about social scientific inquiry, there was also a profound sense of nostalgia. He described in his notes at one point that the East Side was like a happy family. Everyone had their problems. They would argue over anything and everything, but they found happiness in it. And remember, this was written in the midst of the Great Depression. So this was certainly a nostalgic take at this community. So as we'll show you tonight, the spirit of both nostalgia and documentation motivated the images that you'll see and their own reflections on this project. But often Lightman and Simon captured some facets of the neighborhood that they didn't even realize or intend. And in the process, they've given to us a collection that tells us something about the neighborhood, something about themselves and the moment they were living in, and something about the Lower East Side as it became constructed as a site of memory in this moment. So without more introduction than that, why don't we dive into the photos? You're looking here at a photograph taken on Grand Street, where you see an individual, well-dressed, giving charity to two men who are clearly, by their dress and their appearance, impoverished. And I will tell you that this, of course, you can see this is a posed image that they intended to take. And I published an article many years ago that contains some of these images, including this one. And what I learned only later was that this is Lightman himself. He contacted me after the article appeared to tell me it was him in the photo and to tell me a little bit more than I knew about the project. So that's an interesting introduction to get a little sense of who Lightman was and a little bit, and although not a great look, at who he was.
So before we move to the next one, just notice in the background that we've got undertakers up there in the sign. And it's one of the things that you can find out when you look at close-ups at photographs.
Right, and this is so the symbolism of it, right? They're worried that this neighborhood is dying, and they're capturing it.
Yeah, although I don't think they realize that, but it's obvious to us, the irony.
Yeah.
So Deborah, why don't you take the next photo?
So yes, I'm going to talk about this one very differently. It's a picture of the Guaranteed Darners and Weavers shop located in New York City. And looking at this photo together with a bunch of the others, we can see that Lightman and his project was really interested in the mix of Yiddish and English. And so he paid attention to signs. Now, I like this photograph particularly because he didn't pay attention to the signs behind the signs. That is to say, the Good Samaritan dispensary that is located behind the Darners and Weavers sign. The Good Samaritan, as you can see, is a substantial building. It started out as the East Side Dispensary, and it was a place where important discoveries were made about measles, where some of the early milk pasteurization was done, and to provide good health for the Lower East Side. If you go a little bit closer, right, you can see in the window that he's also captured a little girl sitting there who's looking out, and another woman who's sitting close to the window, probably somebody who's actually doing that darning and weaving, sitting in the window itself because of the light that is available. So you get from this a sense not only of the signage, which was what he was interested in, but also of the physical neighborhood. The Good Samaritan dispensary was located on Essex Street. The building is still standing, and it takes you inside to these spaces as well, as you can look out as imagining what it is that the girl was seeing, looking at you, so to speak, through the window.
And I imagine that the 1930s would have been a time where there would have been more need for shops like this. People aren't buying as many new clothes, and so that they're going to be mending more and more. So I noticed throughout the collection, there are several of these, of the darning and weaving. So we can go to the next image. Great.
So I'll start us off on this image and just say a couple of words here. So obviously this is a charity bazaar, but what I want to do is go up close to the sign on the that's a little smaller. There you go. That shows this is run by a ladies auxiliary. They weren't really paying attention to this part of it. They were interested in the charity bazaar sign, but you see that the idea is this is a Lower East Side charity bazaar that's raising money for relief in that very neighborhood. And you see who donated this this shop, Mrs. Barash. I don't think we've been able to figure out. We have some guesses of family names, but we're not exactly sure. And there are a couple of other things I want to look at on the building quickly. This tells us something, by the way, about gender, of course, that this is a ladies auxiliary doing this. But if we can kind of look at the window of you can see that this was once a bank. Can we kind of get up close in that window at all? Just give us a second.
I think on the doors, we can even see it says banking hours.
Yeah, that's what that's what I meant. I'm sorry.
There we go.
There we go. So it was once a bank, but it was a bank that had gone out of business like many others. And in fact, we know from the cornerstone that this was done by Benjamin Levitt. Sorry, I'm making you skip around very fast. You can barely make that out. Who designed, I believe, at least two banks that, who was the architect, I should say, for two banks that went under in this period. So again, this is an example where there's a lot of information in this photo that wasn't at all what they thought they were documenting, but this is the nature of photography, is that its meaning is never static. It changes meaning all the time, depending on who's doing the looking and what they're looking for.
This was actually the Liberty National Bank, and it was located at 150 Delancey Street. And you can make out the names of the bank through the sign itself.
Yeah. Let's move on to the next.
So to give us a feel of what some of the streets were like in the 1930s, is a photograph of abandoned tenements, one after another. You see some of the entryways are boarded up, some of them not. The glass panes in the windows are broken. And this tenement, while it gives one a feel for what it might be like to walk on a street with these abandoned buildings, also raises a lot of questions. We don't know why were these abandoned? Is it because of legislation mandating improvements inside? They shouldn't be cold water flats. They should have heat and hot water, electricity, all those other things. Was it because of the threat of urban renewal? We don't know which block this is on. So I think the photo, though, should sort of give you the mood of what it was like in the 1930s, walking some of those blocks on the Lower East Side.
Much more common in the photos are signs that say to let. So you might notice those signs in photos that come up that are just in the background. You see them in almost every one of the photos, background signs to let, store to let, rooms to let. It makes me think that this is a block, as you're saying, Deborah, that could have been just, they knew it was going to be torn down, and that's why it was so completely abandoned. Yeah. Go to the next one. Yeah.
So this is obviously a going out of business sign for a furniture store. It's hard to know if they did this because of the Great Depression, but I'm guessing not, because they tended to be very interested, as Deborah said, in signage per se. And they liked these things, both all in Yiddish and English. For me, when I worked on the Great Depression, this was a photograph that I took exactly for that purpose, because of course going out of business signs were everywhere in this era. This is, I should say, and this is 1933, so there's a great deal of businesses that are going under, especially those, I should say, that couldn't, things like furniture. Used furniture became more popular than new furniture, just like darning and weaving and repair was more popular than new clothes, especially in an impoverished neighborhood like this. This is Grand Street, which is a major shopping center on the Lower East Side. So there are lots and lots of stores here. And they captured many images on Grand Street. There's something also very interesting here in that if you see the reductions in prices, they're actually different. You can't make out the $250 that goes to 45 and the $500 that goes to 175. Although it's not deception in advertising, because anyone, right, you can read the numbers no matter if you can read the language. It's just interesting that they chose to have different prices in Yiddish and English. I have no idea why, actually.
So the next slide, okay, go back to that one just for a sec.
Yeah, you can't see the 500, what I was talking about.
It's difficult, but notice how the Yiddish and the English are designed equally. It's really quite gorgeous, right? They're definitely this is a bilingual sign. Yeah.
And Beth, I also, in your book, you talk about how some furniture stores became upholstering stores, and that there were ways that some of the places kind of adapted to the times, but another kind of business arose to take advantage of going out of business stores. And those were auction houses that would buy up goods at discounts and then literally auction them off and, call people into the stores through loudspeakers and so on. So that was like another kind of adaptation related to commerce that was happening throughout the neighborhood.
Right. And I think also that they got, most businesses tried to do their own sales before they went to that.
Yes.
They get better money. But
and then another thing, one of the notes I saw was of a Pushcart peddler who I think was selling chairs on the street. He did not want pictures taken because he said all of it was stolen goods. And so he did not want that captured.
So for those of you who can read Yiddish, you'll notice it says business in Yiddish, right? Sweet, right? The permeation of Yiddish by English terms is really apparent in a bunch of the signs. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, next one. So this is an earlier slide, and we included it because it's part of the collection, but also to get a sense of what things were like before the Depression really got severe. This is only January 1930. It's just beginning, and you get the feel for the liveliness of the street with the relationship that the Pushcarts have. A kind of synergistic relationship to the actual stores. Pushcarts bring in a lot of foot traffic, and they work together, not necessarily in competition with each other. So
and stores would even rent out the space right in front of the stores under the eaves to other people. So there was all different kind of levels of commerce, certainly.
Yeah. So there's a real synergy involved, and it gives you a good feel for the dynamism of the street. Yeah.
So actually, if I could take us to the next image, you can see exactly what Annie was just mentioning. Someone selling right outside another store, and this is what that's great. So you see, this woman is actually selling, you probably can't tell, is selling cakes. And again, they're very interested in business and commerce. And in this image, you see a woman selling various cakes. There are different kinds there. They wrote that down in their notes, that there are different kinds. And of course, you can also see, especially if you can read Yiddish, that this is a kosher butcher shop. She's right next door to that. And there are you can kind of tell by the angle of this that there are street vendors like her lined up outside, going in up the street. So you can what they're capturing here is congestion a little closer up than you would see, and the kind of intense commerce, and of course the signage, which they're very interested in. And this is Orchard Street, by the way, also a place that they spent a lot of time photographing.
So here is a newsstand right on the corner of Norfolk and Delancey Street, and I wanted to show it just because I think that one of the things you're not seeing in the pictures are photographs of important landmark buildings. We saw the East Side Dispensary, the Good Samaritan building, but only because it was in the background. So they're really concentrating on the norm, but you're not seeing important buildings like the Forward building, which would have been certainly kind of in the area that they were documenting. But here at the newsstand, and we can kind of zoom in a little bit, there's some treats for us to see. I think a lot of people think of the Lower East Side and they think of Yiddish speakers and all of that. And in 1898, certainly there were about, well, soon there would be, in the first decade of the 20th century, there were about 6 daily Yiddish newspapers to choose from. And that would grow and grow in the 19-teens, 1920s. And then Yiddish readership starts to drop off because of the end of immigration. However, you still see the Vorwärts listed, but most of the daily papers, and there would have been at the time the Morgenjournal Tageblatt as well, but that's not here. But you see the weeklies and the monthlies, more of an array of Yiddish newspapers. So you see the Amerikaner, you see the Zukunft, which was a monthly socialist magazine that was kind of literary. But even though from an American-born eye, not knowing Yiddish, you might look at this and say this is Old World or this is Yiddish, but there were lots of modern ideas that were circulating. And even in 1916, I came across an article recently by a Yiddish woman journalist, Dr. Esther Luria, who wrote essays on important American Jewish women for the new generation. So here is a Yiddish article about Emma Lazarus, someone who never spoke Yiddish, although she interacted with the newcomers. And it was kind of designed as a history lesson for readers about kind of how to have role models who are both American and Jewish. Also a nudist magazine at the top, just for fun, wanted to point that out. But this is a time in the 1930s where the Yiddish readership is going to start to decrease. And so something that was a vital, important, one of the most important forces is starting to wane, although still evident. And one other thing too about Beth's point about Yiddish and English and how a generation like Lightman, most probably the children of immigrants, knew Yiddish but weren't able to write it or weren't able to fully capture it. In the Morgenjournal, which was a Yiddish newspaper in the 1920s and 30s, there was an advice column. And a lot of the people who wrote into the advice column were actually the Americanized children who wrote questions to this Dr. Klorman about their marriage choices and things that they wanted their parents to see. And they had a conflict. They wanted to marry someone, their parents didn't want them to marry that person. They wrote in English to Dr. Klorman, who translated in Yiddish for the paper to give the answer. So it was like through this newspaper and through Yiddish that they were trying to communicate with the generation that they were still trying to please, even as they were moving away from some of the paths that they had set forward. So still vital. The Yiddish newspapers are still vital, but you see the importance of the American newspapers as well, and how American papers have also influenced Yiddish newspapers.
You notice there was baseball there as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So in this one, we have a very different combination of signs. We've got Florsheim shoes, which is a chain. Again, an indication, on Delancey, as was that other newsstand, that it wasn't only local stores that were present. And if you go and look up at the second floor, which I think was probably more what they were interested in, you get a sign for the Tel Aviv Strictly Kosher, a private restaurant, a place that you can rent out for weddings, offering all kinds of delicious meals. So it's interesting to see Tel Aviv, the first Hebrew city, as it was called, taken as a name for a restaurant on the Lower East Side, located above Florsheim.
So why don't we move, oh, thanks, we've already gotten up to the next one. So this is an interesting image. So when you first look at it, of course, a woman is foregrounded, and I want to say something about her in a minute. But you also see, of course, this is Suffolk Street, and they're also interested in the pushcarts lining the streets, which there are many pushcart images in this collection, even though this is a time when the city is actively trying to get pushcarts more and more off the streets, and because it's seen as not part of urban reform and what cities should be. I want to, before we talk about the woman, if you could go in and look at the signage on in the back near the push on, in the background of the push cart, if that's possible. So this is very common, and we've seen a lot of this and haven't really remarked on it. So I want to say that advertisement is all over everything, on the sides of buildings, and they capture a lot of this there. And so you see all the different products, Manischewitz, right? Cereal here, there's Coca-Cola, there's a pipes, and Jefferson's, something that I can't quite read. What is it?
K.O. Jefferson, and movies.
Movies.
White Eagle, right? Yeah.
I
So
love that it's matzah cereal. That sounds horrible.
yes, it does. But they were advertising it. So I wanted to point that out. And then if we can go back to looking at
It also, of course, says post no bills, but yes.
Yes, thank you. And you see just how much that matters, because these are everywhere. If you probably even other images, we didn't point it out, but I noticed it here, so I wanted to mention it. So let's focus in on the woman who seems to be the center of this photograph. The three of us spent a long time looking at this photograph. It may very well be an African-American woman. You can't completely tell, and there aren't notes about that to identify that. You can tell just by looking at her that could be the case. We can't be sure. The dress might suggest that. We can't be sure. But there's some reason why they focused on this woman. And here we're totally speculating. But assuming that it might be, there's also the notion that is often forgotten in constructions of Lower East Side memory about the racial diversity and ethnic diversity that frankly always was a part of the neighborhood and was increasingly part of the neighborhood as it became less densely populated by Jews in this period. So it's just something to think about. This is one of those kinds of issues as historians we can't know. We can guess, but we can't say with certainty.
Yeah, but we can say, as you were saying, that the demographics are changing. And so in this decade, the Jewish population is on the Lower East Side, Italian, Greek, what at the time they were saying Spaniard, but was Puerto Rican and African American. So there's reports of and documented of African Americans moving from Harlem or coming up from the South and living on like Madison Street, kind of the upper part of Madison Street just at this time.
So one of the chat comments said the RKO Jefferson. So that was a movie theater. Yes. So thank you.
Thank you for whoever has better eyesight than us.
Yes. Yeah.
So you want to go to the
let's move on because I'm looking at the time.
Yeah.
So here is
Deborah's favorite.
Someone having herself weighed. She's wearing a lot of gorgeous clothes. If you come in a little closer, you see the nifty hat, the beautiful coat with the single button clasp, the elegant shoes that she has. The scale is, travels around. It's on wheels, and then it's put down so that people can weigh themselves. It certainly does not seem to be typical of street commerce, but it lets you know that you can get it just about anything on the street. And we're going to see a couple more examples of things that you can do on the streets. Yeah.
She's a visitor to the Lower East Side. It's quite clear. And while we probably don't have the time to go into it here, there are visiting the Lower East Side, sometimes in the press called slumming on the Lower East Side, was very common. This was now becoming a neighborhood already in the 30s and the 20s, in fact, to be toured. You might think that starts later, but it actually starts quite early.
Mhm. Definitely.
So should
Right,
we?
and there's a dumping of coal behind it. Thank
Yeah.
you. Yes. Okay, on to the next one. Yeah.
So this is quite a contrast in dress. Obviously, this is someone from the neighborhood, an apple seller. Apple selling is quite cliche, although I don't think they mean it as cliche here in the
Yeah.
Great Depression. And this is another one of their many pushcart scenes. But I think here they're also interested in character. We'll see a few more where they're actually interested in looking closely at individuals. Here that I think it's more than just documenting commerce and industry. This is a character study. This man is older. His clothes are somewhat dirty. He looks cold and a bit desperate here. That's not all they photograph. They seem to go back and forth between kind of photographing this desperation and isolation and loneliness. And there are other moments that we'll see in a few minutes of joy.
Mhm.
So it's hard to tell, but that's what I think is going on in their photograph here.
Yeah, the next one is a real contrast with that. If we move to the next one, because he's pretty happy, standing by his Knish's pushcart. He has his name on it, Benish Dienstag there, Knish's, and he's willing to pose for a picture, right? There's a sense of ownership here. In the background, again, if you're looking closely, it's blurred, but you can see that there's a ladies' hair bobbing store right next to a men's barbershop. So young women, I'm assuming mostly young women, were eager to get their hair bobbed in the latest style. And the contrast of this photo and this kind of character study of a Knish Pushcart man is very different from the previous one that we saw of the man much more desperate feeling of selling apples. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll also say that, and this is documented in their notes, some people they encountered had no desire to be photographed and they wanted them to go away, and others loved it. Sometimes you can see it even different people in the same photo with very different reactions to having their pictures taken.
My favorite was someone said, "Don't photograph me because I want to go to heaven. I want to go to the next world," and that would stop it. Or they were waiting for a long time to take a picture of an older man who kept moving away, and his daughter running the store came to us and said, "Do you want to take my picture?" They said, "No, we want your father's." She's like, "I know that, but he's never going to let you take it." But they had fun with that. What's the next image?
That's
Oh,
for you.
This is my favorite. Okay, so we actually use this in our Russ Daughters exhibit because I thought it was Russ Daughters, of course, is still open, it's still selling herring and many other things. And you want to support a good New York business, it's a good thing to do. They're delivering nationwide, even as they've had to close all their restaurants and stores. But herring in 1930 and 1920, 19 teens was a way to get something nutritious, inexpensive, and it was sold on the street, and other fish were as well. And if you look, the notebooks that we had from them did describe several herring men, several fish vendors. A lot of them were around Suffolk Street, some were around Orchard Street. But one of my favorites is from 30 Suffolk Street. Irving Cohn sells herring, salt herring, schmaltz herring. Irving was in the stationery business, but it went the way of all Depression businesses. It was a lucky thing that he could think of selling herrings. He pays $25 for a stand, but he nets a profit of $35 weekly. A little bit even more fun is the next journal entry, which depicts a conversation. Pushcart peddler, Suffolk, north of Hester. The crowd was milling. The fish peddler was away at the moment. His wife replaced him. A customer approached. "How much?" 18 cents a pound. "Goslin," cried the man. That means swindler. "Gunneth," answered the woman. That means thief. And then I can't say it, an English swear word, cried the man, and then the crowd stopped. And I don't know that this is to be the case, but I infer that the Yiddish yelling, who cared? But when that word came out, that term, that son of a, then the crowd stopped and listened. But just to get a sense, and here though, of course, you see this picture of a beloved fish man with the schoolboys stopping to pose. There was another account, I didn't include it here, of the most popular fish man on the street and how people loved him. And I'm assuming that one is actually the one that we see there. But of course, the food that was sold on the street was also still really important for housewives trying to make a nutritious but also inexpensive meal for the family.
So the next one is actually one of my favorites. And this is a picture of a East Side Hebrew school, as it says. But I really love it, not because of the sign, which is what they were interested in, but because of what's below the sign. And these girls with their school books. And obviously they are walking the streets themselves. They're not escorted anywhere. They look like they're going to Hebrew school. It's a picture that really gives you a feel for the Lower East Side. Across the street, you got a whole bunch of cars lined up there. You can see Garcia's Grand on the corner, which gives a sign of that ethnic diversity, and also a feel for some of the slightly more substantial apartment buildings. The one with the banded white brick and the curve on the corner, that building, it is an example very different from those abandoned tenements, so that there was some decent housing there as well. But these girls are great. They're ready to look at the photographer and to pose and stand still. So it's a wonderful, wonderful picture. I know, Beth, you had some thoughts about them too, didn't you?
Well, I mean, the other thing I wanted to say is, so what they're interested in, as you said, is the sign.
Yeah.
At Talmud Torah, traditional place for Jewish boys to go learn. And of course, these are girls going to Talmud Torah. And the other thing is they're trying to capture the old world. But as you said, there are cars everywhere, right? They're not a pushcart in sight in this image. And Garcia is already there. So this is another case where they're documenting something they don't at all intend.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just a word on the Jewish education of girls, that's starting as early as the 1900s, as these after-school Talmud Torahs are set up to meet public boys who are after public schools. They might as well take girls as well. So usually those classes would be separate from the boys' classes, but we see oral histories and others documenting that girls are getting some kind of Hebrew school education. I think by 1917, 27% of all girls growing up on the Lower East Side at some point in time have some kind of Jewish education. So America is a place where that kind of Jewish education is, as it's changing and expanding, offering education for women, in part, I think too, because in the public schools, they're seeing female teachers, and that's starting to kind of shape who becomes teachers, not in this establishment, but in others.
So I'm going to show you two different images. This is another one of their character studies. And they seem to go back and forth between the young and the old. These kind of images, they really see as representing that old world that that they think is going away with this generation, this man's generation. And you see he's much more traditionally dressed, long beard. They say in their notes, you know, they note his clothes being worn and his beard, his long beard streaked with gray. And this is their attempt to show a Lower East Side that's aging and old, withering and fading, but in some ways also a neighborhood filled with a certain character and emotion. I mean, he's not turning away from them, although he doesn't seem, you know, particularly interested in them in any way. So this is obviously this attempt to get the image of the old and traditional. Unless you have something else you want to say before I contrast that? No?
Go
So
for contrast.
the next image here obviously stands in great contrast. This one again on Grand Street, taken in 33 as many of their photographs were. And here, of course, you see people. I love this photograph. Something about the way they're posed, looking tough in their completely modern American dress. Someone in a nice suit in the background, and the young boy looking on. And of course, when I first saw this image, I said, "Oh, they're capturing a wonderful street scene on the Lower East Side." But again, is that what they're interested in? No, they're interested in, if we zoom in a bit on the background. And we know what they're interested in because of the notes they take. They're interested especially in this moel, ritual circumciser, and this sign for the moel. And you'll see also below it, and they document this too, there's a law office, which tells you something also about the congestion of the Lower East Side. You get very unlike things in one building because you get your office where you can get your office. So again, to me, this is a great image, and we didn't say this, but we probably should. Some of their images are really terrific, but these are complete amateurs. These are not people who are invested in creating photography. They're interested in documentation. Sometimes they get a great shot. Other times, not so much.
Yeah, that's a good point, because the absence of really any kind of aesthetic concerns. It's in a documentary tradition that has not yet seen the impress of the FSA photographs and the other photographs that really change the character of documentary. It's closest in some ways to what Lewis Hine did, but he was a much better photographer of the Lower East Side. So here we have a nice shot of a couple, maybe a family, we're not sure, enjoying their Sabbath leisure. And if we come in a little bit closer, we can see the relationship of the man and woman there. She's got her arm around him, and she's dressed very elegantly with a beautiful white lace collar.
She's been to the hair bobbing place.
And the hair, that's right. Yes, she definitely has a hair bob. Thank you. And the boy, he's sitting there. It's obviously the Sabbath, but he doesn't have a hat on. He's, he does have a nice sweater, no tie, button-down shirt. So you get a feel for, just what the Sabbath brought together. And this is a warmer weather too. So we get to see people's clothing that they wear. Nice shot.
So this is a tresses, bandages, and elastic stocking store. But again, the Lower East Side had many things crammed together. So on the second floor, what we see, if we look at the sign that's on the right, it's just independent Chavra Achim Mikvahs, so the independent congregation of brothers from Mikvahs. They're praying every day, evening and morning, Sabbath holidays and high holidays. So that's the kind of permanent congregation that's there. However, every fall comes the high holidays, and there are many people who need a place to go. So they've added an additional sign, independent Chavra Achim, the congregation of brothers from Mikvahs, and Vladimir. They've joined forces to hire a prayer leader, to hire a chazan, a cantor, and sell tickets. You can get a seat at cheap prices. And so they want to say that, what's important too, a couple things. They're saying it's an airy hall. Because there's been so much congestion on the Lower East Side, every high holiday ad, and this dates from the early 1900s, will talk about the airy, light-filled hall that they have available, because this is the contrast to the norm, which is crowded, lack of ventilation. So everyone is touting airy and light-filled, which continues into the 1930s. I think it's also important that they say that they pray all the year, that this this is not just a fly-by-night establishment. This is a congregation that's offering seats to people. This is not just a businessman who's rented a movie theater and is selling tickets, which did happen. People would rent dance halls, movie theaters, even Tammany Hall, hire a prayer leader and sell tickets for the high holidays, because there were so many what were termed by social workers and Jewish communal leaders at the time unsynagogued Jews, that then they knew that there was this appetite, this demand for high holiday services. So this hasn't changed entirely, but I think what has changed is the places. And I guess this fall we'll all experience what it's like to pray in our own airy, light-filled homes and go by Zoom to high holiday services. But this was a really important phenomenon. The other thing I would note is that the picture was taken November 26th. And as we know, high holidays usually happen in October. So the sign, who's going to want to climb all the way up and take off the sign? But this was common. You see this less, of course, in the 1930s than you would have seen in the 1900s. But the high holidays was the high season also, and that then related to commerce and shopping. So as we've learned, people would come downtown from Riverside Drive, or they'd come from Brooklyn to go to Division Street to get a nice cloak, to get a nice dress. People were still coming down for fancy clothes and then going back uptown.
Yeah, the other quick thing I'll say just about that is, a congregation like this would need to sell those tickets to try to keep themselves afloat economically.
Mhm.
It was a time when actually small congregations that didn't invest like so many suburban or congregations did, and so many in the 20s, big congregations that couldn't be supported. These did a little better than that actually, but they needed the income that came, which was a lot more than they usually got.
Absolutely.
So I'll say something quickly about this. This is and it's interesting. This is all in Yiddish, and it's not translated. There's no Yiddish. There's no English accompaniment here. And this is a mikvah, a ritual bath, and the sign says that it's a kosher mikvah. In this case, that means that it's supervised and meets the standards of Jewish law by a rabbi, and the rabbi, it's underneath the sign, the rabbi's name is listed, who affirms that it meets the Jewish legal standards for a mikvah, and I won't go into what all of those are here. So it could be that the assumption is that anyone who would want such a service, and this is mostly women, of course, who would go according to Jewish law to a mikvah after a certain number of days after their menstrual periods had concluded, to then be clean to their husbands to resume having sex with them, or to even touch them, in fact, depending on your level of observance. Men also used the mikvah for certain ritual purposes, but it's clear this is marketed mostly to women. And you can see that, I don't know if you can zoom in a little bit on the sign that's above the door, that this is there, and this is where there is some translation into English, that their equipment is for, and if you look closely, it says it in both Yiddish and English, they have sort of modern, nice equipment for women, which it specifically alludes to.
Right, and it was very common for a lot of these mikvahs that were underneath, obviously underneath other stores, that would often be Russian and Turkish bathhouse and kosher mikvah. And so it was kind of doing double duty, that there would be like the kind of secular bathing in one part of it, and then in another part of it, the kosher mikvah that's been certified. But I think the businesses knew they had to do both to keep going. This building has an amazing history. It's still present on the Lower East Side. It's actually an L-shaped building. So you would see it on Canal, and then you would also see it here on 5 Ludlow Street. It was built originally as Max Cobras Bank. He was an immigrant banker. Immigrant bankers were incredibly important because there weren't many American chain, big banks that would want to go to the Lower East Side in 1900. And so people were kind of informally giving their cash to the storekeepers who would put it in a bank. But then some immigrant bankers came around. Sender Yarmolowski is actually another person whose name is still embedded on a building. But Max, you can see that it was a bank. This was also designed by Benjamin Levitan, who was mentioned earlier. The beehives that are there, the terracotta beehives, were commonly put on banks to show thriftiness, industriousness. And then the bank went out of business in 1914. I think there was a run on the bank with World War I. Sadly, Max Cobra died. He might have committed suicide. But also in the neighborhood were many what were called Landsmannschaften, or mutual aid associations, that were based on hometown connections and that rehabilitated themselves or resuscitated themselves in the new world, renting a hall or having a space. So this was the Independent Kletzker Brotherly Aid Association from the town of Kletsk. And this was a fairly large one. So they were able to buy their own building eventually. And the top floor was actually where they had services. I met someone who had lived there actually in the 90s, by which point it was a loft, and said that the kind of his bed was where the bema and the ark had been, for the kind of the front of the building, the kind of most holy place. But then by the 1990s, when I was giving walking tours, it had become on Canal Street, it was an Italian funeral place, and on Ludlow Street, a Chinese funeral place. In the middle, had been a Jewish funeral place. But then, so you're seeing like this mixing and this overlap of different cultures on the Lower East Side, but I want to also point to the diversity of, even among Jews, different forms of orientation. So you see here again, so this is a big building. They don't need all this space for the Kletsk brothers. A lot of them have moved on. They're not coming every day. So they have this space that they want to rent to other halls that don't, not all halls, but other organizations that don't have their own formal place. So you see beautiful, big, airy, and light-filled, meeting locals and shuls to rent with reasonable prices. Inquire in the shul. Again, beautiful, big, airy, and light-filled. They repeat. But this could be like a local, like these could be different political orientations. It could be a chapter of a union or something like that that's also meeting here as well. So just because it was the Independent Kletzker Aid Society, there were other things that were layered in at different times. And what's the next one? Okay, and I think this is our last slide before we go into questions. This is another one, and this one in some ways raises more questions than answers. There's a lot more I want to know about this, but I'm going to share with you what we've been able to figure out. So the sign says restaurant and bakery very clearly. And there's, I think, the family name, but I think it's obscured a little bit by the light bulb. But on top of it, there's a little sign that's kind of handwritten more. It's l'chaim idem, to cheers, Jews. This is like a toast. And we see when we look closer at a lot of these signs, the one on the top left says Hitler falls. All the Hitlers must fall at some point. Do you know when that will be? You know, that we Jews will be able to drink, I think to drink to this. And so it's beer, mitarbis, it's like roasted chickpeas for 5 cents a glass. The chickpeas are translated as a bite. But then on the top corners too, you're seeing Telegram, Western Union. So it's like a sign that's advertising a lot of things that are happening. It's appealing in some ways to religious Jews, explaining that everything is 100% kosher, but it also says in the bottom something about intellectuals. It's hard to read all the details of the sign, but you're also seeing the sign of the NRA, not the Gun Association, but the National Recovery Act. A lot of businesses were putting this in their signs to show their solidarity with some of the New Deal organizations. But there's a lot here. I think what had happened was it was a restaurant and a bakery, and then Prohibition was ending in 1933, and they put up some more hand-painted signs. We also know in the collection of photographs that they've documented a big demonstration against Hitler in 1933 at City Hall. So the photographers felt it was important enough to venture off the Lower East Side to document what was happening with many Lower East Siders attending this event. So there's a lot going on here, and we'd like to know more about it. And one of the things we'll do, these have been in our archives since at least at some point in the 1960s, and they'll hopefully be in our archives for many more years. But what we want to do is invite you to explore them, to send us questions, and we want to find out more about them, because these really are a kind of window into an era that we no longer have as much access to, but so many things are happening and so many adaptations are happening. We want to have time for questions, and we'll go. There had been a question asked very early on, I think by Hannah Pollack from the Forward. Let's see.
What was the motivation to have these grad students utilize photography? Why this visual format? Who taught them their craft for this? And lastly, did any of them go on to become photographers?
No.
So Deborah is answering a bit, but I'll say that the 1930s is a moment when historians have described a documentary impulse. There are WPA projects that are documentary. There are a whole lot of, Deborah referenced them, photographs. If you've ever seen Walker Evans or Dorothea Lange's photographs, which are much more stylized and aesthetically pleasing, and they are professional photographers. I think the documentary impulse reached them. They talked at one point about when they had a bigger camera and then they were able to get a smaller camera that they were able to carry around more easily. No one taught them the craft. The impulse came, I think, from a moment in the 30s about photography was becoming more both affordable and popular, and they saw it everywhere, including in regular newspapers. So they weren't really taught this. And that's apparent in some of the photographs that we didn't show you. But the impulse, I believe, comes from the particular era. And no, they did not become photographers. Most of them became social workers, which what they were trained to be. And that's in fact, JB Lightman, who we mentioned at the beginning, went on to a distinguished position at McGill in the School of Social Work.
Another element of the work of the social workers and from the school are the master's theses that they wrote. Those are actually at the University of Pennsylvania, and I believe the New York Public Library has copies, but they're another window into the kind of social adjustment that Jews were undergoing at the time. There are articles about kind of juvenile delinquents and women with different career paths and all sorts of, and deserted women, all sorts of amazing kind of windows onto both day-to-day life, but also social concerns of the time and how they were playing through in Jewish family life and Jewish communal life.
So one of the things that's important to recognize, we didn't mention, is that these photographs were not designed to be exhibited. Mm-hmm. They were designed as sources to help understand the Lower East Side. And that represents a real shift when you get people who are actually interested in photography, but also taking pictures of the Lower East Side where they see the photograph. And this happens with the establishment of the New York Photo League, where they see the photograph as a means of helping the community see itself. And hence the exhibition of photographs, along with other kinds of documents, is really crucial for building a sense of community, for letting people understand their situation. And that's not what's going on here. What is going on here is documentary for a handful of people who are training to be social workers. It's not designed to reach out for the rest of the community. And that's why they never bothered to exhibit them.
Let's see. I think there was a few questions about how the Lower East Side might have changed over time, maybe from 1920s to the 1930s in terms of, and also questions around the pushcarts and kind of where did the pushcarts go?
In short, the pushcarts were banned from the city, I think, in 1938, LaGuardia. That was a really important mission that LaGuardia had, Fiorello LaGuardia. Again, with this idea, everything that when I started out talking about how the city wanted to reform, they wanted to create a modern city, pushcarts dragged that down big time. So the idea was to create dedicated spaces for the pushcarts to go. And so several of those were created. And up until very recently, you had the Essex Street Market on the corner of Delancey and Essex, which is now, I think, moved in. That building has either been torn down or it's going to be torn down. And that's kind of, those stores have been adapted into the newer location that's been built as part of this new revival. But I guess, so for the most part, by 1940 was when that opened. But as Beth was saying earlier, there were attempts to get rid of pushcarts, limit them, police them, that date to the 1920s, but that weren't clearly as successful as they hoped to, really until 1940.
I'll say something brief about the Lower East Side. Certainly, as you could tell, even in that 1898 photo, it was far more densely populated in earlier times, but it was still a very crowded neighborhood in the 30s. It was also, in terms of Jewish neighborhoods, the most impoverished, and actually in the city, only second to Harlem in terms of its rates of poverty. In earlier years, we think of the Lower Side as static, but in fact, people were constantly moving out. There was a turnover in population when immigration was flowing into the city. The 30s was a little bit more stagnant, or if you were downwardly mobile. People moved a lot in the 30s because they were either evicted or they found cheaper rents that they could have for a month free, and they'd move a lot. So if you were moving to the Lower East Side, it's because you were downwardly mobile. If you were staying there, it's because you couldn't go anywhere else by then. There are some exceptions to that generalization, but that's generally true.
It was a comment about cars and the gradual inroad of cars to take up spaces on the street as compared to pushcarts, right? And so, although obviously not every street had pushcarts, there were only certain streets that had them, that were understood to be shopping streets. But yeah, there's this tension between automobiles versus the pushcarts. So there were still horses too in the 30s, right?
Yeah, and there were some great. We didn't get to all of them, but there were some nice pictures of horses and stables in the collection. So all of you who have signed up, we'll be sending you an email tomorrow with instructions on how you can go in our archive and look at these photos on your own. We looked at 25 at most. There are 325. So there's so much more that we weren't able to get at, and we hope that you can look at them. I want to thank Professor Moore, Professor Dashmore, Professor Wenger for joining us tonight and helping us illuminate these photos. I want to thank you all for tuning in. If you're able, this is a free program if you'd like to support the work that we do. And the work that we do is essentially taking our archival materials and making them accessible to as wide of a public as possible. We invite you to make a donation at ajhs.org/donate. It's important to support these institutions that help keep alive the diverse stories of the past. So I think that we can use them as building blocks to build an even stronger future. I want to thank Chelsea Bracci, who did everything to make this work on a technical and storytelling level. She is just amazing. So if you see a box that says American Jewish ... that's actually Chelsea Bracci behind, who made us be able to show you these photos in this way. So I want to thank her, and I want to thank everyone. We have a great conference starting next week. You're welcome to join. It's our academic conference that usually happens over the course of a few days and is now going to be virtually online, and it's going to spread out over the course of 4 weeks. And so you can tune in on the days that you want, an array of fascinating topics. So I invite you to do that. And also on June 5th, we'll be with Professor Laura Liebman, who's just published a book called The Art of the Jewish Family, looking at objects that help us tell the lives of Jewish women in the 17th, 18th, early 19th century, a story that people thought had been told already. But Professor Liebman shows how looking at the objects, looking at material culture, brings together all different facets. So another way we're trying to use the technology that we have through Zoom to really highlight the collections and to get you involved in analyzing them as well. So we thank you for your comments. We thank you for your questions. We thank you for tuning in. And
I have something to say, and that is this photography is now very widespread. Everybody carries it around on their phone. This is an opportunity for you to take photographs of the things that you think are interesting. You're living through history. We're all living through history right now. And what attitude we want to bring to it can be expressed through photographs. And I would encourage everybody to think about it and take photographs, inside, outside, of people, of signage, if you're cool on signage, whatever it is that grabs you.
And we're collecting them. So if you would like to send photos to us for safekeeping forever so that future generations can see them, we encourage you to do so. We've received a few already. My favorite is of a challah that was baked. Everyone has been, not me, but a lot of people have started to bake challahs or challah. And this one is a challah in the shape of a COVID-19 kind of thing. It's kind of amazing and horrifying at the same time. But we really do want to see how you document what you're experiencing, what you see happening around you, whether you're in New York, whether you're in California, wherever you are. Please send us those photos to info@ajhs.org.
And I also put my email in the chat for everyone, so you can send them directly to me. This is Chelsea. So you know they're going to a person, and I will be in touch because we also want to collect the story behind them. And you can also post them on social media using Archive COVID. That's the hashtag we've been using, and you can just tag us in them, and we will be reaching out to get the full story. So please, we want it to be your pictures 20, 40, 50 years from now that people are doing these programs on.
Right, when our great-grandchildren are telling the stories based on the archives for your great-grandchildren.
That's right.
Please.
That's right.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Night.
Good night.
Deborah, bye-bye. Good night.